And I want to also thank TCI, Aaron, for putting this together and asking Paula and I to come and talk with you today. Our topic, you can see, is advocacy strategies for passing Ashley's Law. It's a blueprint for community members. And really, the presentation kind of evolved from a class that I teach at USU Eastern and in the social work department. And I was always under the assumption that learning how to do different types of therapies and learning different modalities, there's a structure to it, there's a procedure. There's certain things that you learn in CBT and solution focused therapy skills, if you will. And I'm like, why don't we teach macro practice that way? And in my mind, a lot of it is very time tested strategies. And I had the opportunity to work with Paula on Ashley's Law. And with looking at Ashley's Law, she has already done a lot of the strategies that we're going to talk about today without really knowing the name of the different strategies. So just as I'm teaching my students, I like to kind of give them a real life example of, hey, these are the strategies that you can utilize, and here is a practical example. I used to do it as the 2019 tax referendum. I don't know if everyone remembered that, where they wanted to increase the sales tax on food in Utah. We use very similar strategies, and that is also what we're going to talk about today. So let me introduce myself before I get too far. I'm Jeff Spears. I'm an associate professor in social work, and I'm located on the Price campus at USU Eastern. And I'll let Paula do a very well-deserved introduction, because her story, like Aaron said, is extremely powerful. So Paula, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself before we get started, and then so everyone kind of knows who you are.
My name is Paula Vigil, and Ashley was my daughter. And forgive me, this is the anniversary of her death, so I'm a little I'm a little worse for wear than I usually am during these. So um, I hope I can present well enough to make her proud. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. And I think looking at kind of this is why we do the work that we do. Working with individuals like you, Paula, um, reignites my fire and my passion to stay in social work and grit. I mean, Paula is the definition of grit, in my opinion, with everything that she's endured over the last couple of years. And in talking about this too, we're gonna have Paula kind of tell her story, and maybe I'll move on to the objectives part of the presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about this disconnect. You might call it a divide in social work between the micro and macro practice. I just think it gives a little bit of a premise as far as like why presentations like this is really important. Oftentimes we'll have interns say macro's too hard. I don't like law or legislation. But in reality is even micro social workers, if you categorize yourself as a micro social worker, you're going to engage in some policies on some levels, right? So if you're looking at billing, you're looking at case notes, you're looking at certain requirements, that there's still that idea of the meso macro that is going to dictate how you operate as a social worker. Then we're going to identify key strategies. We're going to hear Paula's story first, and then we're going to jump into one of my favorite articles. It's a Jansen article, Bruce Jansen out of USC. We won't hold that against him that he's out of USC, but his content is really good as far as strategies for impacting the community. And then we're going to talk about how Paula has utilized some of these strategies, and also kind of meeting with me. We've also done a lot of work using some of these strategies to further her involvement. And then we're going to recruit more advocates to assist with the next step for Ashley's Law. So passing the law was really the first step, and Paula is going to talk about what we're working on next, and then also how you might be able to get involved if you are interested. And then finally, provide suggestions on how to get more involved in meso macro work. And we'll kind of conclude with just some suggestions from us. So really looking about this idea of micro and macro, I think it's important to understand the differences. This is again from a social work context. I didn't really understand this until I got into graduate school. I just thought social workers worked with individuals. I had no idea that the meso and macro were even a thing. So the quintessential micro practice really kind of focuses on individuals, families, and small groups. So this might be a therapist, doing mental health with a client. I even think case management would fall under micro, is helping secure different resources. I think that's the bread and butter of social work, to be honest with you. Is that's how we kind of got our start. Crisis intervention. So this might be the BIT team, or this might be called in for suicide assessments. Those to me, when I think of micro, is the definition. Macro focuses more on communities, organizations, and systems. So in this case, looking at Ashley's law, there was a lack of law protecting a certain individual or a certain group of individuals that Paula wanted to intervene on a meso macro level. So it couldn't be done on more of a micro level. It had to be a system-wide change, which then in return would protect individuals with Rett syndrome, just like Ashley. So indirect practice and policy change. Here are just some examples. Advocating for social justice legislation. A lot of our students, we task them with following a bill. And then what they'll do is they'll reach out to legislators to kind of show support, or in negation of the bill being passed. Letter writing campaigns. I would even say organizing community outreach programs. So those that are involved in maybe coalitions or other boards, to me, that is also more meso macro. And then policy analysis and reform, understanding not only policies, but how they impact you as a social worker. And then also doing, program evaluations, how well the program is performing, and looking at outcomes. So for me, the distinction for those that don't have the social work background is direct client interaction is more micro, and macro is more system level, and also looking at advocacy for change. So this is just kind of like it's really pixelated, but I really like this one. I've used this for a long time. Maybe I should try to update it. But it gives us a different breakdown of each level, right? So the micro is looking at individuals, families. The meso is more neighborhoods and schools. And then finally, you're thinking about macro as far as like policies, law, even like judicial decisions, I think would fall under the macro, right? The beautiful thing about this, it shows that they all overlap. So I use the example of micro social workers might not think about how the macro impacts them. Or I'll hit from students like, I don't really care about the meso macro. I want to focus more on just being a clinician. And my response is always like, well, let me tell you 20 different ways in which the macro is going to impact you every day. More of a like expanding your perspective sort of discussion, not sort of an aha, I got you sort of moment. But it's the same as far as like the micro impacts the macro and vice versa. So this is just a question I wanted to kind of put into the chat. Thinking about your own like education, whether it's in social work or related discipline, if you have a master's or bachelor's, like how much did your education focus on macro concepts? And I asked this question to the social work program, MSW students, and they're like, it actually did a lot, right? Like we took a lot of micro and macro classes together, which made me really happy, because I do think that's what's up this little plug for Utah State social work. I do think we do a wonderful job integrating both the micro and the macro, but that was done intentionally, right? Like faculty members are getting together to plan, learning circles, are getting together to talk about, using macro discussions within their seminar classes. So it's been an intentional effort. Okay, I love this. Jeff Simmons, love the name. One class, it was very brief, right? So you might have just like one class. I think most of their program was focused on the macro. Which program was that, Brooke? Was that Utah State? 40%. So Zoom user gave me a quantifiable amount. Trying to read. My track was micro, but we did have half of macro. 2 classes. I'm learning both. University of Utah. Okay. Yeah, and they're they're really big on macro as well. So, it's a span of different educations, in different settings. I could tell you for me at the University of Kansas, they really kind of brought us in and said, who wants to go into more macro work? You're going to take more administration classes, more nonprofits. Six went into that route. And then again, this is our first semester. So we didn't really know what micro, macro was. And then all 256 of us went into the micro. And I think to myself, like, why make a student decide early, right? With this idea of tracks. To me, especially now that I work in a small community, I feel like I need to be a generalist approach, right? Like I need to know how to intervene on micro levels, but then also make changes within my communities, within my organizations. So I thought that was really interesting. Is that even, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the curriculum that we put out to students have that divide and that dichotomy between a micro and a macro social worker. Um, so again, the disconnect curriculum emphasis. I really like the Rothman article. The Rothman kind of categorized in like a 90-10 split. And I do think just based on my experience of other programs around the country, it is getting better. But what I will say is that really the curriculum dictates the job placements in the real world. So what do I mean by that, right? If you're going to do an internship, if you're going to learn these clinical skills, 90% of the real world or jobs that you're going to get post MSW, at least in my field, are going to be in the idea of clinical, possibly on the meso level, right? So the field placements then would be more focused on to the micro. I can think of maybe two that we've had in the price area for macro placements, Savvy being one of them. Shout out to Savvy. And then also in Utah, up in Logan, there's a lot more placements, I think, for students, just because they have more social workers that can supervise, right? I mean, that's the other aspect is if you have 90% of your clinical social workers engaged in clinical, it's really hard to get a macro placement, right? So it kind of dwindles down a little bit. Students may receive minimal exposure to organizing, policy advocacy, and administration. So a lot of times, like look at the EPAS for social work. A lot of them are mainly on the micro level. You have the one that talks about dealing with diversity. You have the one dealing with policy, but typically it's understanding the agency's policies, right? So it's kind of really interesting, kind of think about even how we shape our own credentialing. Divided in the curriculum mapping, I gave the example of special tracks. You might see that a lot. It might even get more special than that, like specializing in, dealing with trauma, dealing with certain populations like veterans. So it can even drill down more than just like the micro macro track that I described at Kansas. A few courses bridge the two. You might have, like we teach a policy course at Utah State on the bachelor's level. I tried to incorporate micro concepts. So I have them read a book called The Broken Ladder, which talks about different stories that really illustrate the macro connection between the two. So that's something that myself and other professors are really keen on combining the two because we think it's really important for students to learn both. And then lack of faculty specialization. I like to categorize this as like the left-handed pitcher analogy. Is a lot of like programs around the country have someone to come in and teach policy and research, right? Or at the very least policy, and that's what they do, right? Like that's what they do every semester. Again, Utah State is completely different. Like having TCI and even our clinical faculty are so engaged in the macro work that I do feel like we get a well-rounded education for our students. But looking at the totality of the whole, because we have that 90-10 split, a lot of our focus is still on the micro. Agency priorities. So just looking about agencies, not only for interns, but also uh, like after graduation, they focus on very short-term goals. And a lot of that's for billing purposes, right? Macro is a lot of work. Paula has been working on this for years and has successes and then also setbacks. So being able to kind of identify a short-term goal as far as an intake and therapy sessions is something that's justifiable and easier and also covered, for reimbursements to have those different types of goals and services. And then I even think the licensing, I'm just going to drop down to the bottom part. You know, think of the exam that you've kind of taken. A lot of them are focusing on the micro. A lot of the questions on the exams really kind of are situational. You know, you meet a client for the first time, what would you do? Yeah, versus more macro questions and considerations. So now I'm going to turn the time over to Paula and let Paula introduce you to Ashley to kind of talk about the Ashley story. And then what we'll do is we'll transition to kind of talking about the strategies. And then we'll circle back around to kind of talk about how Paula integrated a lot of these strategies already from the Jansen article that we'll look at here in a little bit.
All right, to express Ash, part of what I need to explain is Rett syndrome. And Rett syndrome came into our lives, and it took Ashley's ability to walk and her ability to talk. And it did it slowly, so we got to watch it go. But she never stopped smiling. See that beautiful little smile? That stayed with her almost until the very end of her life. Rett syndrome could take so much from her, but it never took her fight. It never took her smile. It never took her will to survive. And the bad thing is, that did go, but it went when Brian Urban, who was her stepfather, started raping her. She was the size of an 8-year-old. She weighed 60 pounds. She couldn't walk. She couldn't talk. She couldn't simply say, "Mom, this is happening to me over and over and over." What happened is her body told me she started to have severe seizures, and we couldn't stop them. We couldn't stop them with 12 different kind of medications. We couldn't stop them. So her neurologist asked me, "Could you get me some video evidence of these seizures, because you describing them, I don't know what type of seizure they are. I don't know what is causing them if I don't know what type they are. So could you get me some video footage of her having seizures?" Well, to stand over and video someone that you love when they're having a sorry, I can't even think of the huge seizures, and just watch. I couldn't do it. So her stepfather and I installed video cameras. And I went out for one night. I went out to take my mother, who was turning 79 years old, to a play. The next morning, I watched the videos. He knew the cameras were there. It stopped on him raping this small, tiny, broken body. Well, when we decided to prosecute, of course, he was arrested. And when they came to me, they said, If there were special circumstances, such as is it if she was a child or if she was over the age of 65, he would be facing 53 years for what he did to her. But in Utah, there are no special circumstances if the child is an adult who can't fight, can't sit up by herself, can't feed herself, can't scream, can't run, can't tell. I was horrified. I could not believe it. In fact, I've talked to people after person after person after person who could not believe that people with disabilities are not protected the same way as someone who is simply over the age of 65. We elect people over the age of 65 to run the country, and they are still better protected than this tiny woman who could not even tell me mom. So I told them, when this is done, I'm changing the law. If someone ever hurts someone like Ashley again, the law is going to be stiff, and it's going to be secured that they don't hurt anybody else. They will be behind bars for the rest of their lives. No other smile, no other light, no other daughter or son is going to be extinguished by what is happening in their home or in their care or in their school. So we were able to change that law, and it was a fight. It was, it, it started by me telling people this is what is happening, to people not even believing that it could be a possibility. So the first person that I approached was not wanting to help me. So we decided, okay, we're in for a ride. We are going to change this law, and we are obviously going to change it from the ground up by ourselves. So I don't know exactly, because this says our this talks about our next mission. So I don't know if he wanted me to explain how we changed the law or what we are trying to do now. Sorry.
No, you're good, Paula. And I just want to say, thank you for sharing, that story. I know I've heard you tell it countless times, in our presentations, and it really hits me every time, as far as not only the love you have for Ashley, but also to the advocacy work that you kind of put in. And I remember the time that you sat across from me. I received one of the emails that we're going to talk about here in a minute from Paula. And when I reached out to her to have her meet me at the coffee shop in Price, and she told me the story. She said, "I'm going to pass this law." And in my mind, I'm thinking about all the bills that are introduced, in Utah. I'm thinking about everything kind of goes into it. And just looking in her eyes, I was like, she's going to do this. And there wasn't anything that was going to stop her from doing it. And at that moment, I mean, I've been doing this a long time, 15 years as a social worker. That was the hardest story that I've ever been told. And then immediately I went to, well, what can I do? Right? Like, what are some of the skill sets that I have that I can help Paula and be able to kind of get some of the information to people I know, different connections, even forming meetings to discuss the issue a little bit further. So I just want to again thank you, Paula, for telling that story. I think it's something that was needed as far as changing the policy and the law. And then now we'll talk about the next steps in a few slides, but I just think we can, the trainings and then maybe taking it even to national level. I think it would be really nice to kind of see it reach that capacity. And before we do that, though, just kind of sharing the different strategies that she used. I just want to bring attention to the Jansen article. So the next couple slides, we're going to introduce certain strategies, and then I'm going to have Paula talk about what she did in this particular level, right, or stage, as Jansen would call it. So he says there's 8 stages of advocacy. So the different stages start at agenda building. So this is an issue that you're trying to work on that hasn't quite got out of the gate yet. So this might be holding town hall meetings. It might be, as Paula said, meeting with individuals to say, like, how do we go from point A to point B? It really is kind of getting the grassroots movement. Um, you know, Paula was asked to kind of wait until after the sentencing in order to kind of start her advocacy work. So Jansen would say that is also a window of opportunity, right? Anytime that there's media attention, anytime that there's like a big break in the case, people hear about it. So that's the time to kind of strike when the iron's hot. I think Paula would have started it a lot earlier, if not asked by the DA not to, or sorry, the prosecutors not to kind of start until after the sentencing. Um, and then it goes all the way to the other stage, or the A stage, is dissemination. And I think that's exactly what this is. There's 240 people on the call. Paula's heard stories, been heard all over the world. And then also now having people say, like, I would like to become more involved, right? So we talked with some officers that really would like training dealing with individuals that have diagnoses like Rett syndrome, about providing the optimal care as a first responder, about dealing with the secondary trauma of officers responding to an incident like this. So we've kind of had those successes, but today we're going to focus on just one stage. And I think this is kind of, if I had to pick a stage, this is the one I think social work students really like, is the collaborative strategies, the campaign strategies, and the contest strategies. So as you can see, the first one is more together, right? It's more collaborative. Myself as a social worker working in a small town, I always say start with the collaborative strategies, because you got to live where you work, right? And then if you don't get those results, then you can move up to more of the contest strategies. So it's really hard to start contest and move backwards. But if you think of it as a spectrum of different interventions, that's how I always look at. And by the way, I have this in bold at the bottom. I have process over content. So just keep that in mind, is the process are these strategies. And process, once you understand these processes, it can be applied to the content. So that would be, in this case, looking at Ashley's Law. So I'm going to introduce the different strategies, and then I'm going to have Paula kind of talk about the application to Ashley's Law. So the first one is to meet with legislators, staff, and stakeholders. I think a lot of times students and other advocacy efforts, or advocacy experts, skip the staff. But I found that when I'm working with a legislator, if I get to know their staff just as well as I know them, it gets me in with them, right? I'm able to kind of meet with them and be able to kind of work with not only that staff, but also that legislator. Providing information to educate policymakers. So Paula did a beautiful job kind of explaining that is, you know, if they're over 65 or under 18, there's a law to protect, right? But there's a gap right now at the state of Utah. Speak to financial data of the policy. I always call this the cost benefit analysis. So money that you would save, you know, even looking at different voting histories of your legislators, that's also important. And we did that. We looked at key people that voted in not only disability policies, but also looking for social justice concerns, right? So when we were looking at legislators to introduce this into the Senate, we knew that we needed to partner with someone that has a track record for getting these bills passed. And that's, you know, that's why we reached out to Jennifer Plum to help us with that. Use a supportive legislator to introduce the bill and tell the story to representatives, especially if you can get it someone that will, you have to, but getting someone on board in the House and Senate is really key to kind of getting that ball rolling. So I'm going to let Paula just kind of talk about the applications to Ashley's Law, and then I might add a few things as far as what we did together.
Well, my very first step was I did not want Ashley's story to be told. I did not want to be her to be a face of what happened to her. So the very first thing I did was I called our local legislator. She's female, she's local, it's a small town. I thought she'll jump right on board to help. I didn't realize that my first phone call would be non-starter, no time, dumb thing, go away. I didn't realize my second phone call would be that. I didn't realize my third phone call would be that. I didn't realize that I was going to spend phone call after phone call after phone call, email after email, email after email after email after email. I didn't realize just how big of a job deciding to change something is when people realize it's going to be a tough one. I thought it would be you call somebody, you tell them your story, they see what kind of a horror that this law change it. And it's not like that. um, so I made phone calls and I wrote emails and I went up to the Capitol and I could not think of a way to get this passed. I went to Facebook, and this is where I had to tell Ashley's story, where people who knew her, who knew of us, would hear her story. And I had to decide between our privacy and the importance of this happening, telling her story. So I went to Facebook and I said, this is what happened to my little girl. And I am going to change this law. I'm going to do whatever it has to do. The media won't listen to me. Legislators won't listen to me. Nobody will listen, but I am not going to shut up and I am not going to wait. And I started to get discouraged. And this is where the story gets even worse. She never recovered from those seizures that he started. And she passed away while I was trying to change this law. So then I doubled down and I said, I don't care what I have to do. I will go door to door I will stand up at the Capitol with a sign. I will tell my story on social media. I will tell it anywhere I have to go to get it hold, to get this law changed, to make sure that he is in jail. So the weirdest thing is I started I started picketing. Started picketing at his sentencing. And one day I get an email from a local professor, and Jeff Spears said, I want to help you with this. And he sat across from me and he listened to my story. And about the same time, I had an attorney in the local area who said, I've read her story on Facebook, and I would like to help you draft a bill so when you go to speak to legislators, you have a bill in your hand. They have a jump off start. So so my Facebook posts and my community started to matter. People started to reach out to help. And the weirdest thing is I made a Reddit post on Utah, and I said, I can't get this law passed in Utah. I can't get anybody to listen to me. And that's when the media finally reached out to me and said, can we do a story? So my local people are trying to help me, but finally we got on the news. And at the same time, one of my family members invited their local representative from whatever district South Jordan is in from. I should know this because he stepped up to help me. Representative Mark Strong came to dinner and heard my story and said, I've a niece who has disabilities, and this makes me, first of all, awed. I can't believe that it hasn't been changed before. I'm going to help you. I'm going to take that bill. So you may think that what you're doing isn't being heard, and it may be small, and it may be hard, but your voice, your vote, your sign, your post, the hand that you reach out to someone and say, I'm willing to help. How can I help? The only way that we can change what's wrong with our laws is if we decide it has to be done, and we start, and we don't stop until you get one step. So we were able to pass Ashley's law. But during that, we realized that people with disabilities don't have a voice. They don't have a seat at the table when it comes to hard discussions. Like, my daughter couldn't stand up at a podium and tell her story. How many other silent women, children are going through what Ashley did and will never be able to tell? And we decided we are going to change that. And that's our next goal. We are going to make sure that when first responders, when police, when district attorneys, when they get a case where the person cannot advocate for themselves, where they can't tell their story, where they can't testify against their perpetrator, their stories are still heard, they are still prosecuted, and those people still go to jail. And when they do, it's a long time because Ashley's Law is already there. So I'll let Jeff add what I missed.
No, that was fantastic. Describing kind of the steps that you took. Um, and I will say too, I know someone put this in the chat, the letters that Paula has sent. I mean, she was in the hundreds, and this is a few years ago when I chatted with her, and I was one of the lucky ones to receive one of those emails to meet with her. And even in passing the law, um, she would receive a phone call the night before to say like Ashley's Law is going to be discussed, in the House and then the Senate. And Paula, at the drop of a hat, was there the next day, driving all the way from Price, prepared to kind of tell her story in front of, both committees, one in the House, one in the Senate. So to be able to have that opportunity and to tell the story, and all the collaboration that we've done, it took a lot of effort, but it was Paula's grit, it was her determination to kind of get that ultimately passed. And for me, the only thing I would add is, um, you know I do have someone I went to high school with actually worked, I guess, in the senator's office. So I was able to text that person and be like, hey, like I've been trying to get a hold of someone. Can you help me? And the next day I had a response. So that's why I even say staff and people are very vital, because Paul and I were trying to get any senator to respond to us. I mean, we were sending emails, and I was following up with people that she was emailing. And then the other thing is getting this published in a peer-reviewed journal was really important, to tell the story, but also make it searchable, right? In academic records or academic searches. So that was the other thing that we worked on doing is we've done the newspapers. Let's get it published in different avenues as far as the story goes. And these collaborative strategies are one of the many reasons why I think Ashley's Law was passed. And I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to kind of look at just highlight campaign strategies. This one on the left side is one-on-one meeting with legislators, educate the public either through social media, as Paula said, on Facebook, even recording, the um, the picketing that Paula did. That was not only picked up by the news, but also on Facebook. Publish articles and use in the media. We talked about KSL and other articles, why that's important, and having targeted conversations with influential people. And in the case, this one, was Mark Strong being able to kind of put into play Ashley's Law. So this is more campaign working with legislators. And then finally is the contest strategies. This is something too that it's more protests and demonstrations, bombarding with emails. They used to call this like a phone tree back in the day where you call and talk about a certain issue and get people to commit to either writing a letter or signing a petition. And then I'll let Paula talk about the application to Ashley's Law on the contest strategies. Just a few words on.
Okay. I I would hope that most of the time you can get someone to help where you don't have to do these steps, but sometimes they hope you'll just go away. So we had to picket at his sentencing because Ashley didn't even live to see him sentenced. But people showed up to help. They showed up with their signs. They showed up, and the media showed up to help. Um, I know that because of these contested strategies, I earned a lot of enemies in my small town because I had to say our local representative will not help me. I had to go around her. I had to go above her, around her, beyond her anyway. I I know that it's hard sometimes that you want to say, okay, but yes, start with the start with the good ones before you contest. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is do what you can before you contest.
We have a few more slides, but I just want to again thank Paula for the courage and your discussion in talking with Paula about presenting on this topic. She mentioned that it's her responsibility. It's something that she feels is going to propel her into social work. She hopefully is going to join us in the bachelor's program next semester. But she's an aspiring social worker and just just awesome to work with. Like this is why I do what I do. Um, but I wanted to maybe open up for one or two
I'm going to interrupt
questions.
Jeff, and I don't care what he's about to say, but I want to say this man is my hero. Jeff Spears. I'm going to school. I've applied for the social work program. This is past, and her story is still being told because Jeff still gets us conferences. He's still every step of the way. I hope you get to take a class from him. I hope you get to see more from him because this man's he has done a lot for someone that he didn't even know before this happened.
Yeah, and it's awesome to be a colleague, to be able to work with Paula, and I've learned a ton, from doing this, and I appreciate those words. Thank you, Paula.